Hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name's Ketevan. Happy New Year. It's 2024, so that means it's time to go over the stats from 2023 and a little bit of my goals for 2024. If you know me, you know that I don't really have like hard and fast goals for the year. I just sort of like general inklings and trends that I really want to do, and I'm quite pleased with that. I don't really like to have strict, harsh goals that like I fail or succeed in. I just like general trends more than anything. But I really love to hear from you, how you track your reading, how you set your goals, or what your goals are for 2024. If you managed to do your goals for 2023, all that good stuff. I'd love to hear about it, so feel free to comment down below. But let's just get straight into it. So for my main chart that I kind of use as my like general trend, you'll see here that I started off quite strong in the year, but the trend line you can see goes down and down throughout the year. And I'm not sure why that is. The same thing happened the year before that. I don't know. It just seems like around the fall I do a little dip in my reading. It doesn't bother me as much. You know, I'm in academia, so like the fall is when work starts to kick up. It's also when I get sick like clockwork because of the change of seasons. And also, like during the summer, I usually take a vacation where I end up reading a lot, and then on that vacation I finish a lot of books, and I tend to not have a lot of books like in the rotation, so I'm kind of starting fresh with my book selection instead of having like read half a book already that I then finish in those autumn months. Yeah, so other than that, I don't know what else there is to say about it. I will say that compared to last year, I did read quite a bit more. Which is great, but not something I was particularly aiming for. And like always, my ratings have a nice little bell curve, very heavy on the higher rating side, which I'm happy about. That means I'm enjoying books that I'm reading. Very few books with low ratings. So these next two are ones that I pay attention to, but also don't really like think too much in the moment when I'm actually picking a book. The first is publication years. So I kind of like graph out how the publication years are, and you can see here that obviously most of them are more current or modern reads, but compared to last year, I have quite a few more older books, which I'm happy about because that was kind of one of the things I noticed last year, like, I don't read a lot of older books, a lot of older classics. And so I did that this year, which is great. And then also page count. So I'm not a huge fan of big books. I'm not afraid of them though. As I learned during Doorstop or Doom, they are not like that scary. It takes a lot for me to get invested in such a long read. So I do kind of like lean a bit more to shorter books. But this year I actually read a lot fewer shorter books, and overall like all the book lengths kind of like moved a little bit up to more longer books, which is nice. Wasn't trying to do that, but it's nice to see that difference. This is a new chart I made this year. I'm really happy with it. I didn't make it, Google made it, but I started using it. And it is sort of like, it shows the ratio each month of how many books I read on audio versus print. That is one of the goals that I definitely wanted to see a bit more of, because even though I've read, 200 books this year, I know it sounds like ridiculous for me to say this, but I actually don't get that much time to just sit down and read. Which I know it sounds ridiculous, but I only read about 50 books a year in print. And so the majority is an audiobook, which is fine. Like that's what I have time for. I listen to audiobooks when I'm, doing chores, cooking, commuting, going to doctor's appointments, physical therapy, like when I'm doing all the things that I need to do. But it's kind of like a mindless thing. I can listen to an audiobook. But in terms of actually just like sitting down in this nice reading chair that I got this year, I actually don't get to do that much. So I made it a point to track it last year, and I think I did pretty well. But I can see here that like there are some months where I like really just didn't read any print books at all. And I'm not sure what happened those months, but I definitely think it's like a nice way to track it because you can see the ratio more clearly rather than just like bar graphs. And I do the same thing with owned versus borrow. So my big goal this year was to read down my bookshelf. So I had, right behind me, you can see part of it, but it's like a 4x4 calyx, and all four of them in the front were filled with books I hadn't read yet. So my goal was to get rid of 2 rows. I think I did pretty good. I got rid of like 1 row, and so I was short by 1.5 cubes basically. And those were books I didn't read, but I had wanted to by the end of the year. And that's okay. I mean, whatever. I still think I read quite a bit off my shelf, and I'm still happy with the amount of reading I did and everything. But I do want to kind of continue that trend of reading down my bookshelf, because I really think about a TBR of about 100 books is good for me, just because I do need a lot of variety. I'm a mood reader. I do kind of have like 15 books going at a time, so I can't really like have a small TBR, just because like I need more basically. But so I'm not trying to read down to like 0 or anything like that. It's more that I really want to get it to be manageable, where I don't feel any guilt about buying a book or going to the library and picking up a book from the library. So I think I'll get there this year. That's, I think, possible. And so in the spirit of tracking that, I did the exact same kind of graph, but with owned versus borrowed books. And you can see that most months I did really well. And the majority of the books I read were books from my own bookshelf. But you can see in February and November, I don't know what happened. I just like tanked. I'm not sure what happened in February, but I do know in November I committed to a lot of book clubs, 5 book clubs. So as you can see, I only borrowed 7 books, so that probably explains most of that. I think that for this year, I'm gonna do a little bit less of that. I obviously have like the book clubs that I go to regularly, but then there's a lot of other book clubs that I only go to sporadically, and then November just happened to like coincide and they all seemed interesting. But I don't think that's a good idea, just because most of those books aren't books I really want to read on my own anyway. Even if they do sound interesting, I'm going more for like the social component. But like, I don't know. I need to, I don't know, just making a tweak for this year about less random book clubs, but we'll see. And then this one, it again isn't like a huge goal of mine, but I do not love that the majority of the books I read are published by Penguin. As you can see on this chart, over a third of the books are Penguin books. And I mean, that's pretty, like, I think you can't really get away from that, just because they obviously dominate the industry. So like, how are you going to find books not written by them, kind of thing? And of course you could make a concerted effort, but I'm not going to like not read a book just because it's published by Penguin. So, but it's funny because I compare this to last year and it's literally almost exactly the same. I did read a little bit more of independent publishers, but but other than that, yeah, it's pretty much exactly the same in terms of Penguin, which is fine. And then we get into the nitty gritty of, you know, like identity politics and all that good stuff. Like every year, the majority of the books I read are by women, and actually the statistics are almost exactly the same. I think I read a little bit more by women this year. That's probably because of my feminist book club. But the gender nonconforming authors are like exactly the same. And same thing with LGBTQ authors, the same exact percentages. A little bit less this year from disabled authors, which I was a little bit surprised by, but I think that makes sense because I think I read through most of the disabled books. I think I only have like 1 or 2 books about disability left on my shelf. So maybe that's kind of where the gap is from. So yeah, maybe I'll make a concerted effort to buy some more books when I'm ready to buy books next year or this year. And then race, ethnicity. I did read more white authors this year than last year, which kind of surprised me, but then I realized that makes sense because I was reading off my shelf and there's a lot of classics on my shelf that I got for a few dollars at used bookstores, and those books for sure tend to be written by white people. So I think that makes a little bit of sense. I do want to continue to read more authors of color, but you know, it's not something I'm gonna like be strict about. But like last year, I think I'm gonna stick to making a more concerted effort to read more Latino authors, Indigenous authors, and I actually added a category this year of nomadic authors, just because like Romani and Travelers don't really, like, they're not really Indigenous, but they're definitely marginalized, obviously, so I thought a different category would be best for them. Also Arab authors, because even though I think last year I had combined Arab with Asian, or maybe not, or I had happened to read a lot of Arab authors last year, so it didn't like flag as like, oh, you need to read more. But in general, if I don't read at least 5% of my books by that group of authors, I take it as a sign I should be reading a bit more by them. Alrighty, back after a little bit of a break for kitten reasons. So I think I had just been discussing race and ethnicity of the authors, and I think I said everything I wanted to say. But yeah, so basically the Latino, Arab, nomadic, and Indigenous categories were the ones that I hadn't reached 5% on yet, so they're the ones that I'm going to focus on this year. And translation. So this year I was very sad that I did not read more books in French, and that's my own fault, and I like knew it was happening as it was going on. I decided to read an Annie or No in the French, obviously, and I got about halfway through and I realized I hated it, and I didn't just DNF it because I was like, oh, it's so short. It's only 75 pages. Like, I'll just keep going. And it just dragged and dragged and dragged. And I didn't read anything else for the whole year. It took me till like the 31st to finish it. So just like last year, if you remember the Count of Monte Cristo, I was like literally 2 minutes before midnight. I was like, oh, I gotta finish this book so I won't bring it into the new year with me. And so it was the same thing. I was like, oh, I just gotta finish these last few pages. Like, just get the idea of what happened. Like, you know, finish it. And it was a shame because I could have read so many other French books this year and I just didn't because I felt obligated to finish this one. And that's silly. Don't do that. Like, I knew as I was doing it that I shouldn't be doing it. So yeah, basically only 1% of the books I read this year were in French, but I did read quite a bit in translation, about 32%. And of course, the rest were in English. And the gender breakdown for translated literature was great, actually. I was super happy this year. I made like obviously a bit of a concerted effort, but the same as everything else, like nothing extraordinary. And I read more women than men this year. Last year was the complete opposite. So I'm quite happy with that. Difficult to do with translated literature. As you know, the market is saturated by men. So yeah. And then from the countries, I read from a bunch of countries. I didn't add them up, but quite a few, I think. And then the languages, I did add those up. So I read from 31 languages, and 11 of those languages I had never read from. So that was really cool. So I was quite happy with that. But then once I started looking at the map, I saw some gaps, and that's kind of where I want to focus next year. So next year, as you probably can guess, Africa is looking quite gray in this map. So if you don't recall, the dark green, I've read 2 or more books from those countries. The light green is 1 book from that country, and the yellow is I own a book from that country and I just haven't read it yet. So as you can see, there were a few books in Africa. Like I didn't not read African literature, but there's so many more countries to read from, and also Central Asia, but I'm not sure how possible that's going to be, just because I know Central Asian lit is a bit more difficult to get a hold of, but I definitely want to do that if possible. And then this is the map for my whole reading life, or at least since I started tracking books, of course. And as you can see, the map is pretty similar to 2023, a big gap in Central Asia and Africa. So I'm thinking that's a good place to start for 2024. Just like a general like gravitation toward these books, not so much, you know, a hard mandate or anything like that. Like everything, as I've been saying throughout this video. So that is sort of it for my 2023 stats. Again, like I said, in 2024, just continue to read diversely, focus a bit more on disabled authors, authors of color, African authors, Central Asian authors, and of course, more than anything, reading off my bookshelf. So I'm quite happy with those goals, and to kind of aid in my effort of that big goal of reading off my bookshelf, I'm going to make a little tiny adjustment to my book buying system. I made an update sometime this year about my book buying system, and I'm really enjoying it. I like how it's working. It's very simple. It's very streamlined. That's one of the reasons I like it. But basically, it's that for every 2 books I read off my bookshelf, I get to buy a book. And, that's pretty much it. Other than the fact that if I buy a book and read it in that year, I didn't need to count it. So there was like 2 kinds of books. There was books on my shelf that I had bought previous to that year, and then books I had bought during that year. And so if I bought and read a book in that year, I didn't need to like earn it, so to speak. So, and that was more to give myself some motivation to be reading the books I'm currently buying, just because obviously if I'm buying it, I want to be reading it soon. So if I bought it and read it, then it's not really adding to the pile of unread books if it's already read by the end of the year. So I really like that system. It worked really well. But one thing I realized is that this like end date of the end of the year doesn't really make sense. So the system was working beautifully. I was a little bit behind, but I thought I'd be fine. I'd make it up towards the end of the year. And then the Verso book order came in. So if you watch that haul video, I explained that I was going to get a friend to bring them to me, and I wasn't going to get them until January. So I was sort of planning for those to go into the January pile. But I paid for them in 2023, and then they arrived in 2023. So I really couldn't fudge it. And I really felt like I had to count them as a 2023 purchase. So that pushed me way over. But I realized that, like, you know, if I buy a book in December, I basically have like a week or two to read it, which doesn't really make a lot of sense considering the books I read, considering the books I buy in January, I have the whole year to read them. And what I'm going to be doing now is actually more of like a rolling expiration date, if you will. So basically, if I haven't read a book in the first 12 months of ownership, then it becomes like a pre-existing TBR bookshelf, and it's no longer like a new book, right? So for the books that I bought in December, if I read it in the next year, it'll count as like a same year sort of book. And if it goes over that line, then it'll count as like a TBR book. And I think that'll help me because it'll sort of like give these like end of the year books like a second life a bit, and give me a little bit more incentive to read them, because it's definitely, you know, I kind of feel like at the end of the year there's like this like, oh, it's just all going to start over next year anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And I don't want that to be the case, because that's what happened the year before, which is what inspired this system. And so I just don't want there to be like every year like, oh, I failed, so like, oh well, try again next year. So if it's rolling, that means I can never escape and I can never just budget. So I think it'll work. I'm not too far behind, and especially since most of the Verso books I do plan on reading relatively soon, I think it'll work out fine, but I'll keep you updated on that. So anyway, I am really curious to hear about your 2023 reads and your 2024 goals, any things you're going to be changing up for the new year. I'm super curious to hear how everybody does these things, even though I'm probably like one of the nerdiest people out there. I would like to hear more nerdiness if possible. So thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.